Chapter 2. Victor Dubrovsky. Victor was 26 years old. He'd come to Canada when he was 3 with his parents, who had managed to emigrate from their homeland in Russia and had settled in the rural farmlands of southern Saskatchewan. It had been a tough existence, with his father earning a meager living by working as a farmhand when and where he could find employment. Saskatchewan farmers didn't have a lot of money to throw around on extra help, and so Victor had begun work himself at a very young age to help support the family. All the while he toiled, he'd note that when the family went to Regina or Moose Jaw, there were a lot of families that were much better off. So this was capitalism at work. He didn't care for it, and as he grew older, he realized that no matter how hard his family worked, they were unlikely to escape the clutches of near poverty. Early in his childhood, he was never able to visit his homeland after he and his family had left. Airplane tickets from Regina to Winnipeg and then on to Russia were prohibitively expensive, but throughout his childhood, his maternal grandparents would try to visit and stay with them for about a month in the summer. This had happened on about 4 different occasions before Victor was 10, and he loved the time in the evenings that he'd be able to spend with his grandfather. His grandfather didn't speak much about his own past, but Victor was aware that it had been a bit of a challenge for him to visit the West given his work history with the KGB. His grandfather had joined the secretive society at a young age and had progressed through its ranks. Victor wasn't sure how high in the organization he had risen, but it was enough to ensure that he and Victor's grandmother had a nice apartment in Moscow and a decent pension. That was what allowed the travel. It was evident from the chats that Victor's grandfather still harbored ill feelings towards the West, and particularly against the USA. Victor wasn't exactly sure, but he got the feeling that friends had been lost in the dark underworld of the Cold War, and it seemed his grandfather couldn't and wouldn't forgive these past transgressions. When Victor turned 12, he was finally able to travel back to Mother Russia and to stay with his grandfather for 2 months. It had been glorious. He was allowed to tour the Kremlin, he met dignitaries, and was able to read all about the history of the country, from the Revolution through World War I and World War II and into the Cold War. He read about the glorious development of the space voyages that the cosmonauts had made, and about nuclear development in the Soviet Union. He also came to understand the role that the West had played in trying to break up the Soviet Union. Then, a week before he was to return to his life in Canada, his grandfather had said that there was a man that wanted to meet him. He said that he and his grandmother would be going out for coffee that evening, but that this gentleman would come by the apartment. That night, Victor's grandparents had left the apartment right after dinner, and soon thereafter there was a knock at the door. Victor answered, and there stood a large man in a dark overcoat. He had a handsome face, and when he extended his hand, Victor thought it more like a huge paw than a hand. After they shook hands, the man simply said, Victor, it is great to finally meet you. Your grandfather has told me much about you and about your life in Canada. You are a lucky young man." Victor acknowledged that he was indeed lucky, and the conversation easily flowed to what life was like in Canada and also what Victor had thought of his experiences over the summer in his tours of Russia. Victor expressed his admiration for his home country and said that he had really enjoyed himself. The large man's demeanor shifted, and he leaned in over the coffee table as if he was about to divulge a huge secret to a 12-year-old boy sitting across from him. "Victor," he started in a bit of a hushed tone, "how would you like to follow in your grandfather's footsteps and serve your homeland?" he asked. "What do you mean?" asked Victor, a bit surprised at the question that seemingly had descended out of the blue. "Well, since you are positioned in the West, there is, how would we put it?" There was a pregnant pause before he continued. "Information that from time to time you may be able to provide us, and for that we would be eternally grateful. Grateful enough that we'd be willing to put some money in your bank account every month." He sat back in his chair, getting ready to gauge how the young man would accept the offer to be employed in some espionage. "So I'd get to work for the KGB?" asked Victor, his heart nearly pounding out of his chest. The man put a finger to his lips, smiled, and said, "The first rule of working for us is we don't ever mention who we work for, but yes, you'd work for us. We would give you a contact in Canada, and through the next 5 or 6 years, we'd teach you the trade craft that you need in your career. As you advance in levels, the pay will go up, but I warn you, young Victor, as the pay levels go up, so does the danger and the challenge of the assignments. When would I finish? Well, at some point in the future, say when you were in your 40s or 50s, you could return to Russia, and because of your service, you could have an apartment and a pension. Well, I think I'd like to do that. When do we start? We start right now, Victor. Raise your right hand. And with that, Victor Dubrovsky became the youngest member of the KGB and was given his first set of instructions for when he got back to Canada. The agency already had his banking information, and immediately, a small check from a mail-order business in Poland started to deposit monthly checks into Victor's account. When Victor returned to Canada, the initial meetings with his contact were very easy to arrange and manage. He simply went to the local McDonald's and met up with a young man about 4 years his senior. It was clear from the beginning that Danny, short for Daniil, was being tutored in turn by someone else, but that he would always pass on valuable skills to Victor. Soon, the two were practicing the brief skills that Victor would require, and it wasn't long before the in-person meetings stopped, and all personal contact with the regime he worked for stopped. He now made contact only covertly, with messages being passed by drops at secure locations. Victor loved it. He felt like he was serving his original home country, but wasn't really hurting anyone. For the most part, the agency kept Victor on the sidelines, playing bit roles and passing mostly trivial information along. Until Victor turned 17, there hadn't been any life-changing requests, but then came the big instruction. He was to join the Canadian military. Victor did as he was asked, and although his background check turned up some concerns, since he'd been in Canada from such an early age, he eventually was cleared by the RCMP and received his security clearance. Once in the military, he'd been directed to get into the military police. The agency. It wasn't lost on Russia that something was amiss when the first gauntlet attacks on North America had been unleashed in the fall of 2023. They weren't exactly sure what had happened, but they did know that the U.S. had gone to the highest alert footing that it could go to, and that it seemed to be an offensive plot both against Canada and the U.S. From outside, anyway, that seemed to be at the heart of the matter and threat to the security. In order to understand what had happened, the Russian bureaucracy had activated every spy link they had and managed to piece together that whatever the threat was, it had originated in Shiloh, Manitoba of all places, and so they had decided to try to infiltrate the infrastructure of Shiloh about a year after the attacks on Washington. Victor had been directed to request a posting to Shiloh, and it wasn't a highly requested destination, so he soon got his wish. In the winter of 2024, he was moved to the military police department in Shiloh.